Joe, we know you're at the NFL Combine. So what are the latest rumblings on the number one overall pick when it comes to the Titans and possibly selecting a quarterback?
Yeah, the one thing that stood out to me for what would happen with this Titans first overall pick, it really was starting to feel like that the Titans are preparing to trade out, and you start to hear more possibilities of teams trading up into that first overall pick spot. The Giants feel like they are the most likely. Didn't hear anything directly about this, but it feels like it's the most likely if you look at their circumstance to try and get up to one. They are desperate. They need a reset. They need to find something that is going to motivate the fans, motivate the ownership to believe that Joe Schoen and Brian Daboll are going to turn this thing around and put it in the right direction. If you take Cam Ward, who is the more physically gifted of the two quarterbacks who are being discussed for this top pick, Shadeur Sanders being the other one, if you take Cam Ward, who can make all the big highlight plays, he goes out there in a weak offensive class, wins Offensive Rookie of the Year, has a quality season. They just missed the playoffs. I think that that's enough. So right now it really does feel like Tennessee is going to move off that pick.
Joe, speaking of quarterbacks in this year's draft, it sounds like Shadeur Sanders is dropping a little bit. Maybe will be available at 6 for the Raiders. Jackson Dart, his stock possibly rising a little. How would you rank these quarterbacks at the top of the draft, being Cam Ward, Shadeur Sanders, and Jackson Dart, or anyone else that you might think should be up there?
Yeah, well, it's Cam Ward. It's a little bit of a gap to Shadeur Sanders because Shadeur, very accurate, great decision maker. Not the same level of massive arm as the typical guy that we'll talk about in the top 10. Is not the same level of athlete as the typical quarterback prospect we would talk in the top 10. But then there's just a chasm. There is an enormous wide opening. And then there's Jackson Dart / Jalen Milroe, which I've just placed in the same grouping. I think that there is not really much of a difference. It just depends on which guy, which type of player your team is looking for. Are you looking for maybe your own version of Jalen Hurts with Jalen Milroe, who I've compared to him before? Strong, athletic runner, was a little shaky at the Senior Bowl, but looked great in the throwing drills at the NFL Combine. Or if you wanted a guy who's played a ton of snaps, who's super experienced, who's seen it all, who at times shows really good anticipation and touch, and also, again, showed that stuff just like Milroe during the on-field drills. If that's what you're looking for, a guy at the very least is going to be a high-quality backup. Maybe he could eventually start. That's what Jackson Dart is. But I think the one bit that's maybe sometimes missed by fans when you talk about quarterbacks on Twitter and such, that they think that, oh, Jackson Dart could maybe go on and be a starter. There's really nobody outside of the top two that makes sense as starters. Sure, could somebody maybe eventually start amongst this group that's not Cam Ward or Shadeur? Yes, it's possible, but I just find it very unlikely because the options aren't great. The talent isn't great.
Yeah, so it feels like the quarterback class just doesn't have a lot of meat to it. But let's talk about Abdul Carter for a second. Obviously, the big news is that he has a stress reaction in his foot, which maybe will scare away some of the suitors in the first couple of picks, because obviously these are big investments in the future. And if Abdul Carter is injury prone, if that, foot continues to bother him, that's obviously not great. But as far as pure talent goes, I know a lot of people thought that maybe he was the best overall player in this draft. So what's the scuttlebutt surrounding Abdul Carter at the Combine this week?
Well, for me, he is my top prospect in this class. I think that a lot of people get pissed off when you use the word generational, but I think if there was one guy that I would define as generational in this class, it's Abdul Carter. He is somebody who can step in right away and have eventually multiple 15-plus sack seasons in the NFL because he's that gifted. But the way that this is turning out is your typical Combine smokescreen starting to build up. It is the timing of which it's at the start of the week. He's already coming off of a shoulder injury that he played during the playoffs that we already knew. And he played amazing against Notre Dame despite being injured. So part of the reason why we're not really worried about any injury stuff is because we already expected that. The stress fracture in his foot is just another layer to this. It's something that teams in the middle of the back end of the first round are going to try and do in order to see if they can push him back. And now with all this trade scenario stuff and maybe Cleveland being a lot more interested in taking a quarterback than we expected, he could slide a few picks. He could slide to 4 or to 5 with the way things could eventually shake up and who ends up getting selected where. But this to me just feels like one of those situations where he is so gifted that teams are hoping that they can blow it out of proportion and that the media would blow it out of proportion, that he would slide to a team that's picking 7th, 8th, 9th, wherever it is in the top 10.
Joe, last year it was offensive linemen that there was a lot of depth at the O-line position in last year's draft. This year it is that defensive side of the ball. Outside of Abdul Carter, who should be on teams' watch list, big boards for teams picking high up in the draft and need some more help on that defensive line?
Yeah, I think one, the big riser just from the combine amongst that defensive line group, specifically at edge, is Shamar Stewart of Texas A&M. He tested phenomenally well. He's almost 270 pounds. He ran a sub 4.640. He jumped tremendously well. He looked great in any of the on-field stuff that he did. He has been somebody who, since this offseason started, his name has been picking up steam because he's just so physically gifted in that category of just rare athlete that we just don't see. And there's a lot of hope that these NFL teams could unlock more production than what he had when he was at Texas A&M. But additionally, guys that can have really early impacts. We've heard I feel like a lot about Mason Graham and his teammate Kenneth Grant from Michigan. Mason Graham is a really flexible and physical defensive tackle prospect that kind of plays like a wrestler, somebody who could go on to have a ton of sack production because he's got the hands, he's got the burst, he's got the close down speed. His teammate Kenneth Grant is a house, and I really was hoping that he was going to test the combine because he would have put up historic numbers at the combine for a 340-pound defensive tackle. There was a possibility he could have ran a 4.8, which is up there with the likes of Jordan Davis, who had an insane 40 time a few years ago. But for how fast he is, it doesn't really truly paint the picture of what he could be at the next level, which is a problem against the run and then a little bit of an upside to become a moderately productive pass rusher as a nose tackle.
Yeah. We also have an interesting class of veteran quarterbacks who are going to be free agents and, or be able to be traded. So of the quarterbacks that are available to some of these teams, because when you look at the quarterbacks in this year's draft, not all of them look like generational talents. Which of these veteran quarterbacks do you find the most interesting for some of these teams looking for quarterbacks?
I think that the only option, frankly, now that Matthew Stafford's off the board is Sam Darnold. And I think that most people would agree with me there that, like, outside of Sam Darnold, you're kind of trying to resurrect some situations that didn't really work elsewhere for multiple seasons for multiple teams. The Darnold situation, though, is like really interesting because I wonder if the Vikings are going to try and tag and trade him, which for their sake, doing that is the smart move. You could end up getting really early draft capital from a team that badly wants him and badly wants to find their solution at QB. And if they don't think that they can get into the top 2, they're going to want to make this work no matter what. Outside of that circumstance for Darnold, if he's not tagged and he gets the opportunity to choose, he should command a contract similar to what we saw not long ago with Baker Mayfield. And that worked perfectly for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I would hope that Darnold is smart enough to be very picky on where he decides to go and that he goes somewhere like when Baker Mayfield went to the Bucs, that it's a team that's ready to compete now and has good receivers, has a quality offensive line, and a very competitive defense.